លោកអ្នកនាងជាទីមេត្រីយើងសូមស្វាគមន៍លោកអ្នកនាងមកកាន់កម្មវិធី Idea Talk របស់សារព័ត៌មាន The Cambodia Daily នារាត្រីនេះដែលយើងមានវាគ្មិនរបស់យើងអ្នកស្រី Olivia Enos អ្នកវិភាគខាងផ្នែកគោលការណ៍សាធារណៈរបស់អង្គការ Heritage Foundation នៅរដ្ឋធានី Washington និងអ្នកស្រី Sula ប្រធានក្រុមប្រឹក្សាសហគមន៍ខ្មែរអាមេរិកហៅកាត់ថា CACC លោកស្រីទាំងពីររូបនឹងចូលរួមពិភាក្សានៅលើប្រធានបទមួយប៉ុន្តែនៅថ្ងៃនេះយើងសូមអធិស្ឋានចំពោះលោកអ្នកនាងមានអ្នកស្ដាប់និងទស្សនាកម្មវិធីរបស់យើងជាធម្មតានោះថាយើងនិយាយភាសាអង់គ្លេសសុទ្ធសាធនៅលើរឿងថាតើសហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកមានគោលនយោបាយយ៉ាងដូចម្តេចចំពោះប្រទេសចិនក្នុងរឿងដែលធ្វើឲ្យមានការឆ្លងជំងឺកូវីដ នេះហើយមានរោគកូវីដ នេះហើយនឹងជំងឺ COVID-19 នោះបាទហើយយើងសូមអធិស្ឋានថាយើងមិននិយាយភាសាខ្មែរបានទេដោយសារពេលវេលាយើងខ្លីដូច្នេះយើងសូមចាប់ផ្ដើមដោយតទៅនេះ Good morning Olivia
Good morning how are you
I'm fine how about yourself
Great
I'd like to introduce our speaker today Ms. Olivia Enos Mrs. Olivia Enos is a senior policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. She specializes in Asian studies and work at the Asian Studies Center of the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. And with us today also is Mrs. Sula. Ms. Sula, Sula, hello, how are you?
Hello, hello.
I'd like to welcome both of you. Ms. Sula, is a president of the Cambodian American Community Council, CACC, based in California, USA. I'd like to begin our discussion today, and I'd like to make a brief introduction that we all know the coronavirus originated in China and spread around the world, creating COVID-19 pandemic. Infecting close to 5 million people and causing some 300,000 deaths worldwide. Here in the United States, total cases tested positive close to 1.5 million. Perhaps it reached 1.5 or more today, and nearly 90,000 deaths were reported as of Monday, May 18, according to the Center for the Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. Many countries, including the United States, want to hold China accountable for the pandemic. Now, my question I'd like to address to Ms. Olivia Enos, what is the official U.S. government policy or position toward China in COVID-19 matter? Impose more sanctions, take it to international court, or what?
I think that there is a strong desire to hold China accountable primarily because the Chinese Communist Party has mishandled the response to COVID-19 right from the get-go. So we saw them silencing whistleblowers like Dr. Li Wenliang, who was simply trying to alert the world to what was taking place in Wuhan. And then we saw the Chinese Communist Party actually taking citizen journalists and forcibly disappearing them. Some of them have not yet reappeared. And not only this, but we actually saw the Chinese government lying to the World Health Organization about the extent to which coronavirus could be transmittable from human to human, despite the fact that they were actually witnessing that today. And so I think there is, definite grounds both here in the U.S., but I mean, you're hearing it from all corners of the world. Australia is calling for an investigation. The European Union is calling for an investigation into the actions that the Chinese Communist Party took to cover up these facts. Because at the end of the day, we actually saw China lying about facts, the death rate, the infection rate, etc., and making the rest of the world less prepared to handle it. So an investigation shouldn't just be into the facts of what the Chinese Communist Party did, but actually seeking to identify individuals and entities who could potentially be sanctioned. So hopefully that's the direction that the U.S. government will go.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. Do we anticipate the Chinese retaliations in any form? What will be the economic impacts to the American manufacturers and farmers?
Of course. So we have seen China already retaliating against Australia. They have restricted beef imports there. And I think that, that may be the first of many. This is a typical play out of China's playbook. We saw China doing this against South Korea when they deployed the THAAD missile technology, and China didn't like it. They restrict tourism to South Korea. But I don't think that that should be an impediment to us moving forward. The reality is that the U.S. and China relationship is a unique one where there's symbiosis and actually interdependencies, both in the form of trade, also in the forms of debt that's held by both countries. And so I think that there might be some forms of retaliation, but there's also a recognition of the economic significance of the relationship. So I think with that in mind, the U.S. should continue to pursue measures that hold individuals and entities accountable, but doesn't fundamentally change what the trading relationship is, because Heritage has long advocated for the promotion of free trade that even extends to China. And so the hope is that we can get that relationship back on track without failing to raise the very significant and severe human rights violations that the Chinese Communist Party has obviously engaged in, not only during COVID-19, but even preceding it.
We shall see what's going to happen in the next few weeks or months. Thank you, Olivia. I'd like to address this issue to Ms. Sulak. I'd like to focus first on the Cambodian American community, since you work with the Cambodian American community a lot. What have you learned during the pandemic about the members of the Cambodian American community in your area and elsewhere?
That's an interesting question. It's kind of like a little of a baffle for me, the fact that there's a lot of the Cambodian community who doesn't really understand the U.S. and China relationship. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah. And, China has this big ego ever since they adapted Kissinger, policies in the 70s. They have taken advantage of the U.S. in terms of trades, markets, and I guess like Mr. Roger in Hildale, when he had an interview with Hildales, he said that America is a little bit naive because the fact that we believe China will change their policy, and that is something that I want to be able to clarify with our with the Cambodian community, that China has this big ambitions where they want to be able to become the superpower, and just like their Belt and Road Initiative, that is something that impact the Southeast Asia, and that's something that the Cambodian community must look into, because if we don't pay attention, we might end up losing, portions of our own land and even the port that's really important to Cambodia right now.
Okay. Now, that will lead me to the next question, but I just want to follow up on my question real quick. Do they experience insufficient information about the virus, the infection, or how to stay safe? I mean, from your experience, your contact, your work with the community there in the California area.
I don't think they receive insufficient information, but I believe they receive a narrative information from a lot of the mainstream media. For example, one of Olivia current news article where she was referring how Prime Minister Hun Sen tried to curb with China, and that the leaderships try to downplay the COVID-19 and the problem that's in Cambodia right now, and that's something that mainstream media is lied to the community, and so it's our duty and as a Cambodian American community to be able to educate and open up facts and real information to the community. So our goal is really to keep our community connected with the real source, real news, and that's pretty much our goal.
We learned that there are some losses of members of the Cambodian American communities. Have you detected like a sense of anger among the Khmer, the Cambodian American community, toward the Chinese government?
Absolutely. There's I would say 100% anger towards the Chinese government. One, Beijing has influenced the Cambodian policy. This is according to Al Jazeera, I believe, that Beijing heavily influenced the Cambodian policy. And so this is something that the Cambodian communities are a little bit furious because Hun Sen pretty much, you can say China is Cambodia backbone. He is sliding more towards the communist side rather than the free policy. And that is something that tick the community or, irritates the Cambodian community because they want to be able to do something, change the policies, or change the policy that's affecting the Cambodian community in Cambodia. Except there's no possible way to change.
Yes, many in Cambodian American community here in the United States are not surprised about Hun Sen tilting to China because he was a former Khmer Rouge army commander during the war and defected to Vietnam in 1977. Olivia, you wrote an article back in mid-April suggesting what Southeast Asian countries and the U.S. have done. Praising and also suggesting what the Southeast Asian countries and the U.S. should have done and should be doing to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you tell our audience what you wanted these government to do one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the article, I identified kind of a sliding scale of the types of responses that we saw. And, Cambodia was ranking very low. I was saying, Hun Sen himself was in denial that COVID-19 was even a threat to the Cambodian people, even going so far as suggesting that he would go and visit Hubei province in the midst of the height of the outbreak. Now, while that trip was canceled, it was replaced with a visit by Hun Sen to Xi Jinping. And I think that this really does demonstrate the extent to which China and Cambodia are, really cozying up and almost taking advantage of COVID-19 and some of, I think, the anonymity that's created while a lot of other countries are focused very internally on their own domestic outbreaks, which is understandable, of course. But some of the things that I highlighted that I thought were a good area of focus are we can't have countries in Southeast Asia getting away with using COVID-19 as a tool to weaponize their own political objectives. And what we've seen is Hun Sen actually, calling in and arresting individuals either for spreading quote unquote fake news about COVID-19 or because of their affiliation with the opposition. And this is, really unacceptable. And so the U.S. needs to be very clear in its opposition to that and in its condemnation of that. It also needs to be a little bit worried about the use of surveillance technology. A lot of the countries have been using this, rightfully to trace and try to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But we know that surveillance technology can easily be repurposed for authoritarian ends. And in a place like Cambodia or Burma, I would really worry about how it's going to be used in the long term. And then finally, I think that the U.S. should make clear that it's not afraid to use sanctions authorities if it needs to target those individuals who are violating human rights, even in the midst of the pandemic. And I also think that the U.S. needs to make sure and continually reevaluate the aid that it's giving to Southeast Asia, because it has been very generous. I think the U.S. is the number one provider of aid worldwide and a top provider of aid to Southeast Asia. So it should be continuously recalibrating based off of the ever-increasing needs due to the challenges presented by the pandemic.
Have you detected or seen any signs President Trump is using his leverage, American aid to Cambodia to try to help improve the situation there? Have you seen anything like better now than just double talk?
I mean, I think that there's a recognition that there are huge needs, and so there's not necessarily a political motivation behind the aid that's being given other than to merely alleviate suffering. And I think that's right. I mean, we're all going through and suffering together as we experience this sort of new normal after COVID-19. And I think the big question is kind of what do we do once COVID-19 has passed or once the height of it has passed? How do we make sure that those governments are respecting human rights, and how do we make sure, the U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific strategy itself has a values component to it? And how do we make sure that U.S. presence in Asia also means promotion of freedom, promotion of liberty, and protection of human rights? So I think that's a big question going forward. But I will say this. I was really pleased that prior to COVID-19, the Trump administration, I think in December, sanctioned 2 individuals on corruption grounds in Cambodia. And that was a really positive move, something that, was a long time coming. So hopefully there's more of that up the U.S.'s sleeve.
In your research, have you found any country in the region in Southeast Asia that has done well or better than others in terms of preparing itself to deal with the pandemic effectively? Can you identify one country?
So really early on, Singapore stood out as kind of an ideal model. And I think that Singapore is unique, both in terms of its size and also the fact that surveillance technology is like an average part of ordinary Singaporeans' life. They've kind of already accepted that infringement on their personal privacy and liberties. And so I think it makes it a lot easier for the government to engage in contact tracing. That being said, even after I wrote the paper, there was a very large outbreak in Singapore when they had sort of their second wave of COVID-19. So I think there's no foolproof or fail-safe way to prevent COVID-19. But obviously, social distancing has been proven to be really, really good, making sure that people have good hygiene, are washing their hands, and, maintaining their social distance to the extent that's possible. I think, the big question that everybody is asking themselves is what happens as we transition out of a social distancing phase? I know I'm in Pennsylvania right now, and there's some question about, I think the stay-at-home order is set to expire on June 4th, but a lot of people are nervous, have anxiety about that. And I think that's something that's being shared, common shared experience all across the globe, whether you're in the U.S., Cambodia, China, or anywhere else.
There's a question from our listeners and viewers asking this, and wants this question to Olivia. Countries in the world, I don't know exactly how many right now, but there are some countries in the world now joining Australia to investigate the COVID-19 matter. Do you think it's going to be possible? It's going to go through?
It remains to be seen, obviously, but I think that if the U.S. can sort of seize on the political momentum and the political will that does exist around the globe, I think it's possible to build and kind of coalesce a coalition of the willing to hold China accountable. There are also some other investigative measures that might be going on for the World Health Organization, but that would be investigating more into how the World Health Organization handled or mishandled the COVID-19 response. And it's interesting because different countries are calling for different things. Australia was calling specifically for an investigation into China. The European Union was more focused on the overarching approach, which is why you haven't seen China lash out at European Union or European Union countries quite so much. And so I think that it'll be the U.S.'s job to really define and narrow that messaging and make it clear that, yes, we want to not only have lessons learned from what went wrong, whether that's from China or the World Health Organization or some other entity, but that we're going to actually identify individuals who will be held accountable and those entities that will be held accountable. Because I think talk is cheap, but action is not. So hopefully they will actually turn rhetoric into action this time.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Sulak, what can you advise as community activist to Cambodian Americans here in the U.S. and people in Cambodia What should they do to be safe and healthy?
I would advise that, the Cambodian community follow the CDC guideline, practice the social distancing, constantly wash your hands. And I know that some area require you to wear a mask. So follow the private entity regulations. If they want you to wear a mask, wear that mask. And constantly, keep each other alert, knowing that if you know a certain area of your district that is heavily infected, or you need to be able to, start practicing that safe practice by not intervening in the area that's heavily impacted by the COVID-19. So the best practice is stay home, constantly wash your hands, and just, practice that social distancing.
Thank you. Olivia just said a few minutes ago that countries in Southeast Asia, especially Cambodia, since we speak Khmer, shouldn't weaponize, this COVID-19 to suppress the freedom of speech and, the right of the people. Now, the question is, should the Khmer government, Hun Sen government, be more open and truthful to his people?
Yes, I strongly believe that Hun Sen should be more truthful, but as you know, a communist country, especially communist China, they embrace, there's no sign of embracing individual freedom or any rules of law. The same with Prime Minister Hun Sen. I'm so sorry, my phone is so the same with Hun Sen. He doesn't embrace freedom or, individual freedoms or the rule of law. So technically, he's gonna hide half of the factual informations, within his people. And I heard from, I'm sorry, I forgot my source, but I heard that the UN, there you go, the human rights groups had explained to me that Hun Sen had recently passed a law where he suppressed the entire...
the state of emergency, something like that.
Yes, the state of emergency, that's correct. And that's giving him total power, absolute power over the people. So it makes me feel like we're traveling back in time to one of those totalitarian ruling where he has absolute power and the people has no saying at all. So yes, he should keep the COVID-19 transparent and honest with his people, but unfortunately, with communist China as his backbone, I don't think he's going to be transparent with his people.
Do you think Hun Sen will agree to make China pay for the pandemic?
I think that Hun Sen will make China pay for the pandemic?
Yeah, we'll go along with the United States and other countries to sue China, to hold China accountable. That's what I'm trying to get at.
I don't think he's going to go with the U.S. Personally, this is me. I think he's going to lean more towards the communist China. And that is something that's a problem within in Cambodia right now. If he remains to, if he doesn't embrace that individual freedoms and the rule of law, Cambodians will continue to be oppressed by that regime.
Yeah. We have seen some journalists are still in jail simply for saying or reporting, what is true concerning the virus, coronavirus, and COVID-19. The government called the reports fake news. So whoever spread fake news should be sent to jail. Okay, we have a question from our listeners and viewers to Sue. What will happen to Cambodia in terms of politics and economics areas if China is down by surrounding with this complaint due to COVID-19, because we know that China did not handle the problem good enough. and also was not transparent. And Olivia just mentioned that China lied, didn't tell the world the truth. So what will happen to Cambodia if China is surrounded by all the complaints from countries around the world? Is it going to affect Cambodia economically and politically?
Technically, this reminds me of the scenario where I don't know if I should bring this up, when during the Vietnam War, when Kissinger asked the king, who would you like to side, with the communist regime or with the free country? He said, we wish to remain neutral. This questions is the same thing. Do you wish to remain neutral, or you're leaning towards the communist China, or you want to keep the bilateral relationship with America? That is something that the leaders should consider, think deeply, because right now, if you follow the U.S. and China relationship, we are pretty much having a trade war, and there might be like an economic impact later along the line, especially when Cambodia rely heavily, the import and exports. The number one buyer consumer is America, and China rely on the U.S. dollar. So that is something for the Cambodian leader to really pay attention. As a leader, do you want to side and keep the bilateral relationship with America, or do you want to push straight towards the communist country?
We have another question from our listener and viewer for Olivia. Do you think, do you see any chance or possibility that China would forgive debt to countries indebted, with Chinese loans, low interest rate loan, or what you call soft loan or something like that, because of the COVID-19 pandemic that affects each and every country?
Yeah, well, as Sue mentioned earlier on, China has used the Belt and Road Initiative to really take advantage of a lot of countries, not just in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, all over the globe. And so I think given that, it's highly unlikely that China would ever forgive any type of loans. I think that there's enough evidence from China's behavior with other countries. I mean, the Sri Lankan port situation is coming to mind, where Sri Lanka was going to default on their loan. So China said, okay, great. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and take over the port. Now, that's not how China has behaved in every instance, but I think that behavior is emblematic of what is possible, maybe even what is likely. I think it's highly unlikely that China would ingratiate itself to some other country by forgiving their loan. I think it's a lot more likely that they'd be trying to create dependencies on China that make it so that it's able to leverage that for greater geopolitical power. And I think, this is an area where the U.S. can really demonstrate that it is a good faith actor in contrast to China. I think the U.S. has given aid generously all across the globe, and the purpose of that aid is not to create dependency on the U.S., but to ensure that the citizens in those countries are able to enjoy the freedoms that they're not always guaranteed by their countries. And so I think that really demonstrates the difference between what a human rights-based leadership, what a values-based leadership looks like, and what Chinese leadership looks like, which is basically a rejection of values and policy. So I think it's unlikely that they'll forgive loans, even given the grave nature of the COVID-19 crisis.
So in your view, you don't see any possibility at all that China would voluntarily forgive loans to any country? So the end result is that someone has to make China accountable or pay for what it did. In your article, you kind of put wealth, rule of law, and governance structures together. Whether a country may or may not win in the war on the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I was very focused on ensuring that countries are held accountable, that they actually follow through on good governance practices. I think the US has a long history of giving aid and promotion of not just democracy, but just good governance. I don't think that the aid automatically requires there to be some sort of overnight shift, but that there would be institutions that are developed that the people of countries, whether it's Cambodia or somewhere else in Southeast Asia, feel like they have institutions that they can go to. I think the unfortunate reality is that, you know, many of these countries have not been willing to undertake those changes at the top level, and Hun Sen would be chief among them. If you had strong institutions in Cambodia, you would not have had what took place where the Supreme Court invalidated the or the CNRP as a legitimate opposition party, because those institutions would reinforce and check power. So I think that there's a real need to even look back and reevaluate the types of assistance that we are giving for the promotion of good governance in order to shore up those institutions that, I mean, at this point, Cambodia cannot be called a democracy. So I think there's a need to basically start from the ground up.
Yeah. I just want to touch on the economic issue a little bit. You and I know, you know as well as I do, that after Australia indicated its willingness to go full speed on investigating the sources of the coronavirus and how the Chinese authorities, the medical community handled that problem. China retaliated by imposing a ban on meat importers from Australia, 5 companies altogether. So the effect is felt immediately after someone is trying to do like harm, for example, to the Chinese. So do you think any other countries, you have enough support, I mean, from other countries to go along, say, for example, Australia or the United States, to go take China to court or demand, accountability from the Chinese government? Do you think we'll be successful?
I don't think that we will be taking China to court. I don't think that this is something that can be handled by the International Criminal Court or the International Criminal Court of Justice. I don't think that's what we're pressing for when we're looking for accountability. I think we're looking for something much more specific. And I think the sanctions authorities that are already on the books, whether that's global Magnitsky sanctions, which can target on human rights grounds, or just placing somebody on the specially designated nationals list for other concerns, or even I know Congress is actually considering legislation that would be unique to pandemics, where they would be able to hold individuals accountable for covering up and misreporting information that obstructed the rest of the world's ability to respond to a pandemic, whether it's COVID-19 or something else. And I think that's really what we're angling for here. Whether or not you can build a coalition of the willing, I think is dependent on whether or not free nations have each other's back. So I think that there are a lot of ways to, attempt at least to overcome some of the hardships that the Chinese government may be inflicting upon Australia by creating greater trade partnerships or stronger trading and economic relationships between countries that share our values. And so I think, the response to authoritarianism is not to hole up and close our own borders, whether that's through trade or otherwise. The response should be to continue to promote freedom, and that means free information of goods and otherwise. But it also means holding individuals accountable when they do transgress those norms and values.
So you think what Australia is doing right now, Australia is trying to create or to introduce the Magnitsky type of law like the one in the U.S. Do you have any recommendation for Australia in the process, I mean, for making this law, the law of the land in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that other countries are thinking about replicating some of the models that have been so successful in the US. And I think, Global Magnitsky is a relatively new sanctions tool, but being able to use a tool that's traditionally been used in the national security context for a human rights issue, I think really demonstrates that addressing human rights and promoting values is in the interests of the US, and therefore it would be in the interest of Australia or the UK or any other country that might be considering these tools. One maybe recommendation that I would make is that, there was some confusion when Global Magnitsky authorities were originally created as to whether they could only be levied once per year at the end of the year in December, or whether or not they could be used strategically at key opportune moments. And I think creating agility in whatever, treasury or treasury-like body that they have to respond very quickly and swiftly once they have the evidence for, an individual perpetrating a rights abuse or engaging in corruption, I think that will make the tool much stronger.
Okay. Thank you, Olivia. We are approaching our, the end of our program now, but I still have one or more two short questions. One will go to Sulak from our listener named Sokdina. She asked that President Trump has said repeatedly that, or even called coronavirus the Chinese virus, COVID-19, the Chinese virus. Okay. Without even having solid evidence yet, at least from the medical or international communities. That's why Australia is trying to conduct a full investigation or ask for a full investigation. So will that make China angrier? Because, you keep saying things that without proof. It's more like allegation instead of fact-based accusation.
So you're okay. Sorry, I'm trying to grasp the question. So you're saying
you want me to repeat the question?
It's okay. I'm just going to reiterate what you just said.
Yeah.
So what she's asking is when President Donald Trump uses the China virus, that is fabrications because it hasn't been proven. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That will make China more angry?
Well, technically, it was proven that it came from
Yes,
Wuhan.
It came from China. Yes.
Correct.
Right.
Because on December 6th, a man linked the Wuhan wildlife of the virus. So that was the first phenomenon when the virus started to spread all over the news. There was actually proof already, according to the Western Medicine Journal, where Dr. Zhang from the Hubei province, I think that's how you pronounce the hospital.
Yeah.
Hubei.
I don't know. I don't remember. I remember the province is Hubei.
Hubei. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Yeah. So he declared that there was 180 patients affected by the virus, and that was December 26th. That's right. Long before President Donald Trump even said the Chinese virus. So that was already proven that there's facts and evidence before he even uses it. And technically, it's just a name where it linked to the origins of where the virus came from. It's just like the Hong Kong virus or the there's different names that link the virus to the origins of where that virus came from. So there is proof since December 6th when the Dr. Zhang Jing had declared that 180 patients was caused due to a new coronavirus.
Yes.
Could I just jump in really quick?
Sure, please do.
I just wanted to say, I think that in general, it would have been much better to stick with COVID-19 or the novel coronavirus as the way that you were, identifying the disease. I think, some of the unfortunate ways that it was called the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, or I mean, even like silly names like the Kung flu, or
Yes,
I think
we've
that
heard
did
all sorts.
undermine U.S. credibility in saying those types of things. And so I think that it would have been better to stick with it, because I think, people who want to use that in the wrong direction, who would, view it as an opportunity to act in a way that would, really disrespect a lot of Asian Americans or other Asians across the globe. I think that's completely unacceptable. And I think it's been really sad to see the rise of like some of the anti-Asian American sentiment.
Yes, I've heard of
the one that
cases,
comes, yeah, the one that comes to my mind is in the Sam's Club in Texas, where there was the knifing of the poor Asian American family. And I think those types of things need to be unequivocally condemned, which is why I, personally call it COVID-19 or the coronavirus.
Yes.
But it's definitely tricky.
I agree with you completely. I mean, we have enough. So this leads to my last question. On the Sino-U.S. relations, the pandemic has upended people's lives throughout the world. People just want to go back to work, to normal life again. Can the U.S. afford to go to a full-scale trade war after the pandemic, then to military war with China on Taiwan and the South China Sea? Olivia?
Well, I think heritage has been really clear. A lot of my colleagues have worked a lot on the free trade issue and strongly advocated in favor of free trade. We did not think that the massive amounts of tariffs against China were something that was good, because at the end of the day, a tariff is taxes on the American people, and the American people don't need to be more taxed, especially after the economic ramifications of COVID-19. Right. So I think that to the extent that is possible, we need to be able to punish China for its unfair trade practices, like, for example, stealing intellectual property. But that can be done in a very unique way, kind of like along the lines of the sanctions authorities that we were talking about earlier on. And so I think it would be better over the long term to pursue that, and also to continue to promote free trading relationships with other countries around the globe.
Thank you. Sue, what is your view on the question? Do you think we talk a lot about holding China accountable, but we don't want to go to real war as such, killing people. So trade, okay. How are we going to punish China for what it did?
I mean, I agree with Olivia. We have to take precautions in terms of the trade, because they have benefit. It's an unfair trade. And one of the article from Hillsdale's that they were mentioning, there's like approximately 700 companies in our stock market and bond market, or the capital market that is a Chinese companies, and then about 86 of them are listed part of the New York Stock Exchange. And if you pay attention to our stock market, there has been where some of the stock just disappeared, the Chinese market stock. So our stocks is not, you can say, a fair stock at this point. And at the same time, there is something called the Made in China 25 strategy designed, where they try to dominate our key technology sectors, and there's a lot of Chinese company that's stealing our, you can say, technologies, and computing. So that's something that we need to look into, in terms of fair trading, pushing a little bit more of a stronger policy towards where China, communist China, would be unable to steal those technologies from the U.S. And being able to check into those 700 companies that are involved with the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, our stock and our market bonds.
Thank you. That's all the time we have today, and I would like to thank Olivia, Senior Policy Analyst Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Olivia, for taking the time to share your thought with us on our program. And also, I'd like to thank Sulak, President of Cambodian American Community Council, CACC, for waking up early in the morning on the West Coast to talk with us and share your thought and your experience with us. I'd like to congratulate, I don't know if you finished your dissertation, but Sulak is also a candidate for a PhD in political science, so I wish you luck. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Olivia.
Nice to meet you too.